for the California Independent Booksellers Alliance. We have committees, and this is co-sponsored by our Mosaic community, which is the committee made up of the primaries owners of BIPOC-owned stores. We're also partnering with Riverchild Media and my platonic girlfriend, Yana DeSomes. So welcome, everyone. We are recording this, and we are also live streaming this on Facebook, just so that you know that. Post questions, again, because we want this to be interactive, in the chat at any moment. Also watch in the chat for links for physical galley requests and for digital galley requests. And there's something else in the chat. Nope, that was it. Oh, identify yourself. So whether you just do it with your name on your screen, but if you interact, we want to know where you're from and what your story is. This is a nationwide gathering, so it really will be fun to see how far everybody is apart or how close they are. I see Mother Rose from Underground Books there. Mother Rose, I'm waving to you. And I see my friend Jerry Thompson. So it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce Jason Mott this evening. Jason is one of my favorite authors. I've been a little bit of a geek on this one. Ever since The Returned, his books and his writing has resonated with me as a reader. And I would say that The Returned is still in my top 10 favorite all-time books. Hell of a book. Maybe he's bumping it out or bumping someone out anyway. New York Times and the US and USA Today count him as one of their best-selling authors. Jason lives in southeastern North Carolina. He has a BFA in fiction and an MFA in poetry, both from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. His poetry and fiction have appeared in various literary journals. He is nominated for a 2009 Pushcart Award. He has authored 2 collections of poetry, and as of August 10th, this will be his 4th published novel. Entertainment Weekly is already touting this Hell of a Book as one of their heavy hitters for summer. I'm so excited to talk about this book. So Jason, let's start with how you doing.
Hey, I'm doing terrific. Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
And this book is a little bit of a departure. I mean, there's definitely some humorous elements, but there's still that deep, what I call soul resonance. How did you come up with the idea of these 2 characters?
Yeah, so it started when I was on a book tour for The Returned, actually. It's funny that you mentioned that. So when The Returned happened, when that book got sold, I went from answering phones at Verizon Wireless to being on this book tour and being a best-selling author, which was a pretty wild kind of turn of events. And so I was on this really wacky book tour for about 2 months and just had a lot of misadventures. And I wanted to write about the comedy aspect of that. I just thought it was so absurd at times and so funny, and meeting all these kind of cool people and weird people. So it's funny because I was just talking to someone today, this book got shot down so many times along the way. My agent kept saying nobody wants to hear about an author on book tour. And so years passed, and somewhere in the midst of that, there was so much of the news happening with police shootings and just the general, this isn't new history at all. Obviously, the plight of African Americans in America is kind of well documented. But I reached a kind of tipping point where I wanted to incorporate that into my writing a bit more. And I wasn't sure how to do it exactly. And I remember this idea I had about this author on book tour. And so I decided to combine this author on book tour narrative with a lot of my thoughts and a lot of my personal history. There's a bit of a memoir element to a lot of this novel, just to kind of have that discussion. And so in the act of doing that, I also wanted it to be, I didn't want it to be a depressing ride the entire time, because I wanted people to laugh. I wanted there to be humor, and I wanted there to be comedy and absurdity and all kinds of things. And so as I was going through the writing, I was working on this balancing act of trying to have this very serious conversation about race and identity in America, and at the same time have this very non-serious conversation about what it's like to be an author on book tour. So that's kind of where you get this weird thing where the book swings from being very comical to just silly to being very serious and very heavy at moments.
And particularly Soot, when he got his name, that scene for me, I think for all of us who have been bullied on the school bus, that in particular will punch you in the heart. Is that part of the autobiographical part, or?
Yeah, there are definitely some components there. Like I was very much the kid who got bullied on the school bus. I mean, I was the bookworm who just kind of sat in the corner and read all day. And those kids don't have a easy time in school most times. And so for me, a lot of that was, they didn't nickname me Soot, but there was a lot of, we went through our fair share of, bullying moments and nicknames and all those kinds of things. So that's part of what I pulled from my own kind of past and just definitely kind of balled it up. I've had those moments on the bus. Like it wasn't just one moment, as it never is with bullying. Like it's never just one moment. It's a string of moments that kind of thread together and build out this really tough experience. So I wanted to kind of capture that and put it into this project. And that was definitely one of the more emotionally challenging moments for me to write, because it definitely involved me facing a lot of things and really kind of dredging up a lot of old emotional baggage, but it was very much worth it.
Yeah, it very much the 12-year-old is deeply buried in there now, for me. So thank you for sharing that much intimacy. And then the author is kind of a wild guy, and I like his what I'm going to call use of old-timey phrases. What inspired that?
Yeah. So that came from, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to balance a lot of the gravitas with like the fact that I also wanted to write a comedy. Like I wanted to write a comedic kind of venture. And one thing I am, maybe it's because I'm a writer, or maybe, it's chicken or the egg kind of syndrome, but I love language. I love films and stories in which language is a character, which language is very heavily based on it, like Deadwood, The Wire. And I actually love film noir, like the old Maltese Falcon, all those, that whole genre of Humphrey Bogart, kind of fast talking and everyone just living in that. There's a certain cadence and rhythm to that particular era of language that you don't find anywhere else. There's a speed to it and a craft to it. And I'm sure very few people actually spoke that way in the real world, but within the film of the genre of film noir, it was very much a heavy trope. And I remember watching Double Indemnity a lot of times. And so I have a big collection of film noir, and I wanted to replicate that because to me, I love any specific language. And there was just a lot of fun in mimicking that language and just having that speed and cadence and just sometimes silliness of that kind of machine gun language. So it was a lot of fun.
It definitely was. I also liked your sense of geography, the vagueness. Is that what it's like to be on book tour?
That is very much what it's like to be on book tour. It's funny, like when I was on the tour for the returns, there was one moment about 3 or 4 weeks in where I woke up in the city and had no clue where I was. Like it was 1,000% I was just on Earth was all I really knew. Because I've been traveling every morning, wake up every morning. So at one point I woke up this early morning. I go downstairs I'm in this hotel and I go downstairs and there's no indicators as to where you are. There's no sign saying, hey, welcome to whatever. And so I go outside. I had an early flight. I get on this taxi and I'm in this taxi and like I had to call the airport to do something with my ticket. And the woman on the phone said, hey, what airport are you flying out of? And I said, that is a great question. I turned to the taxi driver and I said, hey, where am I right now? He goes, well, you're on interstate, whatever. I was like, no. Like what city, what state, where am I right now? He gave me the weirdest look. I'm sure he thought I was just, drunk out of my mind or something. He says, oh, you said you're in Boulder. I was like, oh yeah, Boulder, Colorado. Of course, I know that, sure. And so I wanted to capture that with the story. Cause again, it was the goofiest moment of my life to not know where you were, but it's what book tour is like sometimes.
Have you read Danny Gardner?
I have not. You make a list though.
You've got to, I'll get you a copy. But his characters, I don't know if anybody can see that, it's Ace Boone Coon. His characters are those same noir, just like I was reminded of that suddenly, of that same kind of slick, easy Rollins kind of smooth operator guy. So we talked about the geography. There was something else. I like the author's kind of a philanderer. There's a great line in there that the problem with married women are their husband. I can't remember.
Yeah, I remember the line was part of the reason why I don't have encounters with married women because it leads to encounters with married men.
Yes.
And I hate that I have that memorized, but it's in my brain for whatever reason. So that part of the novel, the author's philandering is very much the fictional account, or at least that's my story and I'm sticking to it. That's the fictional part of this whole narrative.
You haven't been naked in an elevator.
Well, the jury's still out, until the court case is settled. We can't really talk about it. No, I'm just kidding. No, I've never been naked in the elevator at 3 a.m, thankfully. Yeah, actually, it was funny. I was talking to a friend about this novel as I was finishing it up. And I told him that I wanted the novel to kind of work almost like how Impressionist painting works, where it's not about capturing the reality and the specificness of what it is. It's about capturing that feeling, and you use the absurd strokes to kind of capture that. And that's really that was very much how it felt to be on book tour. Like you're running from cab to plane to cab to hotel, and it's just this flurry of action and moments that all kind of blur together. You meet fun people, strange people, weird people. It was so much fun. But so the goal was to just kind of bottle that up, and so that way, because I wanted readers to have time to laugh and to actually like take that load off, because there are heavy moments in the book. As you mentioned, there's Soot and there's his whole narrative. There's the police shooting that occurs. There's the boy that the author is seeing again and again throughout the novel. And those are a part of a very heavy, very serious conversation. And so I kind of describe it as like those heavy moments are kind of like going underwater. Like you're down there, there's all this weight on you, and you're buried in the seriousness and like the gravitas of this moment. But I don't believe in holding people there. So I wanted to have those moments of comedy to just bring you up for air and let you really refresh before you went down again and had those serious kind of thought-provoking times.
Indeed. I have a lot of emotion. I'm also on jury duty and I can't talk about it, but there's situations in your book that are also going on, particularly with the shooting.
Yeah, I think that there is a bitter timelessness to the story. Because as my editor and I have had a lot of conversations about this. And one of the things that he and I have kind of not gone back and forth on, but talked about a lot is just the component that like this isn't a new story, and that's the sadness of it. And it's probably not going to be an old story for a very long time. Like it's going to be a contemporary story for probably quite a while, and that's a very bittersweet kind of component. When I finished the novel, there are moments in the novel where they list a few names of individuals who have been like police shooting kind of victims and names, and as you finish a novel, it's a year before the book comes out, a whole swath of time passes. And I knew at the time, like I knew when I finished, I was like, there'll be new names before this book comes out. Before this book is published, there'll be a list of new names that this book is discussing. And the book actually has a brief conversation about that, about the idea that like you can't future proof for the names, and you can't plan all the names because they're always going to be there. Like the name list goes back to 1619 and the name list continues running forward. And it unfortunately, I won't say always will, because I try to be a bit of an optimist. But the conversation that this book is trying to have and the conversation this book is engaging in is not one that just started 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And it's not one that's going to be finished by the next summer or anything like that. It is an ongoing part of American history and American contemporary culture.
We have a couple questions in the chat. Yana wants to know, what do you want readers to walk away with after reading your book?
I want readers to walk away with a perspective they may not have been able to get. I think a lot of people wonder about, they see things on the news, they see people protesting, they see, African Americans having discussions, they see a lot of things that it's hard to get into and hard to have a conversation about. I think the irony of where we are in American culture right now is that everyone's afraid to have a really direct kind of conversation. And because of that, you kind of create these spaces, like the novel kind of functions in this space where it swings between a very direct conversation and a very kind of inadvertent conversation. But when it's done, I hope readers are able to kind of come away with a few of the perspectives that they're not able to get. Like, there are discussions in the book about what it's like to be a Black parent and to have to talk to your child about police and what their skin color means to them. There are discussions in the book about colorism, like, racism, kind of, not, just that thing that Black people oftentimes do to other Black people. And there's a lot of history. I don't want to go into the whole history of that, but like, the book talks a lot about all these small kind of institutions in American culture. And I want readers to kind of come out there with perspectives that they probably aren't able to get from certain conversations, because there are a lot of conversations that are hard to have that the book tries to have with readers and tries to kind of pass on to them and say, hey, this also is a component of what it means to be this person in America.
Chat is blowing up. I don't know if I can catch up. One of the things we didn't talk about, though, was the invisibility. That was very powerful for me. The not only wanting to be, but needing to be taught to be.
Yeah, the invisibility. So for those who haven't read the novel, part of Soot's narrative is that his parents are trying to teach him how to become invisible. It begins as a game and it evolves from there. I won't give any spoilers, but it evolves outward from there. But this idea of not being seen, of being invisible, is a large part of Soot's journey, and it's part of my journey also. Like, I can do events like this and be very gregarious and very outgoing and very outspoken. But if you meet me in any other context, like, I try really hard to kind of disappear into the background. Like, I'm an extreme introvert, even though, again, people don't believe that after they hear me do events like this. But like, crowds intimidate me. And a lot of that goes back to the idea of, there's this idea of safety. Like, when you're the kid being bullied, you want to kind of disappear. You want to not be there. You want to be anywhere else in the world. And so Soot has a big component of that. Like, he's kind of grown up being bullied, but then there's also this component of for his parents, at least, if they can teach him to kind of be invisible, they see it as a safety net. Like, if you're ever in a position, if there's a police officer and like things start going a way that you don't want them to go, you can always just kind of disappear and fade away. And the book tries to discuss that component there, because there's a double-edged sword to that. Like, part of the problem with disappearing is that your voice disappears with you also. And that is not a very positive thing. Like, when we kind of contract and we reduce ourselves down, we reduce our voice, we reduce our experiences, we reduce our narratives in both the personal space and on the larger kind of American landscape as well. And that's part of the discussion of this novel, is what happens when you have these people these voices that have been forced to kind of be smaller and not be heard. How do they deal with that? How does that kind of affect them, and how that may affect others behind them?
Then we have, did you have any sort of writer's block while working on this?
Actually, no. This book, unfortunately, luckily, this book went really smoothly. Well, I won't say that. Definitely will not say it went smoothly. But it was always going somewhere. It evolved and mutated a lot. So I never had any writer's block. My personal philosophy is that writer's block is oftentimes just fear of writing badly. And once you accept that you are going to write bad at some point in life and just kind of lean into it, writer's block tends to go away. So I luckily I haven't had many bouts of writer's block in my career. Again, I think it's just because I accept that I'm going to write really terrible stuff for a while before the good stuff comes along, and that just makes it all better.
And then Osira Simmons wants to know, what was the hardest scene you had to write in the book, if you can share that?
The hardest scene is, there's a few hard scenes. It's probably the scene with Soot. There's the scene early on with Soot on the bus where he's being bullied, because again, that went back to a lot of my own personal kind of stuff. And so I had to have a very honest kind of facing of those moments in order to put them down on the page with any kind of emotional honesty. And that was very difficult. Like, it's something that I think, when you grow up, when I was a kid, I was very small. Like, now I'm, 5'11", 200 pounds. I do jujitsu. Like, I'm very active. Like, I can, I'm not the one to be bullied anymore, so to speak. But yet you always carry that part of yourself that was the bully. Like that part of you never goes away, and that part of you is always there. And you have to learn to communicate with that part of you and to kind of accept that other version of you for who they are. And so a lot of that was putting that on display and just putting it for people to see, and that was very difficult to do.
Who was the book written to or for, and is there a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. It's funny, I didn't figure this out until I was very much deep into it. Like I was literally in like late revisions of it. The book was actually written to my younger self. And again, I didn't know that until I was almost done with the book. But it really is a discussion with who I used to be. And so it's written to that version of myself that I was. But it's written for those other kids and those other people who go through very similar kind of experiences. Because I've definitely come to realize like it wasn't just me, and it's not just me every day that lives this existence in America. Like when you have the skin color, when you have a certain identity, whether it be this or some other kind of iteration of a minority identity, like there are others who share that experience. And so the book was written for the people who can share that experience and who can find something for themselves, some kind of meaning in that, and hopefully some kind of solace and some ability to help navigate that. So yeah, definitely written to me, but written for those, you know, the inscription of the novel is this is written for all the other mad kids. So it's for all those other kids who kind of went through that similar experience, which I think is a pretty big demographic.
Yeah, I think that's why it resonates with me so much. Growing up in Utah, being native and being queer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There was those bus scenes.
Yeah. Those kids, man, they find you. Kids are tough. And then they try to tell you, oh, just tough it out. It'll be okay, and it'll go away. You'll be out of high school and it'll go away. And they're like, yeah, it kind of goes away, but it kind of doesn't. And you just kind of have to come to terms with it. I think that's the big part of it.
And then Antoinette wants to know, was your goal to encourage more direct race and policing conversations?
Yes, wholeheartedly. And that was a goal that I hesitated to actually have for quite a while. When you read The Returns and, The Wonder of All Things, my previous novels, The Crossing, there are discussions of race and identity in those, but it is very much in the background. Like they're very small conversations that get had. Because part of the challenge that I've had as an author, and there's part of the book that actually has this conversation, is that when you're an author of color or an author of some other demographic, like you're never allowed to just be an author. Like it always comes with this tag as like Black author or, LGBTQ author. Like it always comes with this very big tag attached to it. And which also becomes a double-edged sword, like, because there are parts of you that very much wants to speak for that voice that is the identity that you are, but there's another part of you that isn't just that identity, that you are sometimes just an author and you want to be treated as that. And so after doing 3 novels and kind of avoiding this topic and still not being allowed, quote unquote, allowed to avoid the topic, I decided I just kind of turn the lens back around and kind of run head on into it and really have this discussion. Because it's a discussion I have with friends in private, but I had never really put it into the forefront of my writing. And so that was very much a goal for this book. Once I had made the commitment to making it the core of the novel, it actually flowed very easily and came out very, very quickly. So I was happy about that.
And then Jared, who is here at Capitol Books in Sacramento and a dear friend, he says your novel is classified as a work of fiction. However, in which section of the bookstore would you like to find your book?
Fiction is fine. I think its first home will always be in fiction, because there's definitely a lot of there's more than enough fiction to qualify it as that wholeheartedly. Like is as much as there is semi-memoir kind of components to it, it's definitely a work of fiction. So I think fiction is absolutely fine.
And what makes you want to be a writer?
What made me want to be the writer? John Gardner's Grendel, not to put too fine of a point on it. When I was much, much younger, so I used to read, again, I was just a nerdy kid. I used to read a lot of Greek mythology and African mythology, just anything mythological. That was my bread and butter. I was so obsessed with it. And one of my favorite stories was the Epic of Beowulf. Like I was really young and I found that book way too young and I really loved it. Like the story of Grendel was just really terrifying to me. And, Beowulf is such a brave, amazing hero. And I loved it. And so when I was around 14 or 15, I had an English class and we read an excerpt from John Gardner's Grendel. And for those of you who don't know, like John Gardner takes the story of Beowulf and kind of inverts it. So the story of Beowulf is a hero comes to the Northlands and he kills a monster named Grendel, and he goes on to kill some other monsters. But what John Gardner did was he retold that same narrative from the point of view of the monster. And when I read that, it was I really very vividly remember just kind of having this almost electric feeling of, wow, like I didn't know that as an author, you were allowed to take something as big as Beowulf and just completely turn it on its ear and maybe look at the story through a completely different lens. Like the story of Beowulf was never the same for me after reading Grendel. And when I had that feeling, I very vividly remember saying, I want to do this to other people. And that was the day, like literally a couple of days later, I started writing short stories and things built out from there. So John Gardner's Grendel made me want to be a writer.
And Paula Farmer from Book Passage and the chair of our Mosaic committee wants to know, I'm actually going to add to her question. She wants to know if you'd like to see this book adapted for TV or film, or do you expect it to be? And would you be interested in adapting it? Can we tag on with how was the Resurrection adaptation?
Sure. No, that's good. So I'll answer the second question first. Resurrection was terrific. I had a great experience on the job. I have to admit, like I did nothing for that show other than like show up at a few times and meet people and just kind of like, but it was a really great experience because of the fact that it taught me a lot about how television works. It kind of got my feet wet on that side of the industry. But it also was great because the executive showrunner, Aaron Zellman, and the cast and crew were all super welcoming, which sometimes LA people aren't super welcoming of authors. So it was really refreshing to have people be very welcoming. And like, I got to have a lot of conversations about how things were working. But at the same time, I was on the outskirts, and like, that was Aaron's show and he did a great job with it. So I gave a big thumbs up to Resurrection. As for adapting this to film, I'm open to it. Like my agent is kind of in the process of like doing things on that side now, and hopefully things will go forward and we'll see how that goes. But at the same time, so yeah, I mean, it'll be cool to kind of see it made into a film. And yeah, I would like to be involved in that process just because this story in particular was a very personal one. So I want to have a bit more guidance on it than I have in previous projects. So if it makes it to film, awesome. Like that's a really cool thing. And I would love to see, there's a few actors I have in mind I would love to see be in certain parts. But as far as, it's not something I'm chasing. I'll say that's the best way to say it. Like I really am just excited that the book's being published because again, like I spent a lot of years pitching this to people and everyone's saying, no, that won't work. No, that won't work. No, that won't work. And then I did it and all of a sudden, like it seems to be working. So I'm very excited about that. So
who's your dream cast?
Well, at some point we have to have Nick Cage in it. So for those who don't know, like Nick Cage appears in the novel. Like I'm a amazingly huge Nick Cage fan. So he has to show up at some point in the movie. That's a deal breaker if he doesn't. But as far as actors, like I've been a fan of Donald Glover's since before Community. And if this ever went to film, and I would love for this to be put on his doorstep and say, hey, I would love to him knock on his door as the person I would love to just be a part of this project if it ever went to that.
So not too big of dreams.
Yeah, if you're going to dream big as you can. And that's my life philosophy. Like small dreams, get them out of here. Let's go big or go home.
And I feel like I may have missed some questions. So feel free to raise your hand, turn on your video, and I'm happy to call on you if I did. Looks like that. Maybe I'm caught up. So what's next?
What I'm working on another manuscript right now. I'm always working on a new manuscript. I can't talk too much about it. Like I don't talk about manuscripts in progress because there are these very delicate things that I don't like to share too early. But yeah, the next project is, just work on another project. I got to get this one out the door first. There's a whole lot of pre-pub stuff to get done. And it's, you want to give every project the best shot running. So as much as I'm working on other things, the 75% of my attention is going on getting this book out the door. But there will be another project. It probably, as of right now, it probably will have a lot of other discussions about race in America. I won't say I definitely won't always write about this topic. But for now, I think this is the space that I want to exist in for a couple books. So yeah, I think that's where I am right now.
Awesome. It looks like there's a good comment. A nice comment from Kira. I see readers who like a book that has meat with the potatoes, as one of my customers described. In other words, a book that gives you pause to think and not something you can just burn through.
Mm-hmm.
Kira,
Yeah,
I don't know if you've read it, but amen.
exactly. Yeah, that's how I am. Is like I want to linger on books. Like I'm not a. I mean, I definitely have books that are fast reads and they're fine, but my favorite books are the ones that stick for a while. I like that meat and potatoes kind of thing.
Then how much do you think your poetry affects your fiction writing?
Dramatically, like my fiction writing would not be where it is now without poetry. Like I can expressly remember, like before I got into poetry, my fiction was just very long-winded. Like that was the thing I actually struggled with, was that I just kept going and going, kind of like how I talk. But then at some point I started taking poetry, and poetry forces you to be so efficient and so terse. Like you have to be able to do a lot in a small space. And so when I started incorporating that into my fiction, it cleaned up a lot of the muddled messiness of my fiction and just made it a lot crisper, made it move a lot better on the page, taught me to kind of turn corners much more. It's a weird kind of analogy, but it's what happens in fiction, I think. So it taught me to kind of turn corners more sharply and convey things in a better way.
Is there a certain region of the country you'd prefer to concentrate on for setting?
Southeastern United States. Like I'm a Southern boy, even though I don't, sound like it in his accent. Like I'm a Southern boy, and the South is a very complex place. That's the best way to say it. We are the Hicks and the rednecks and the weird people and boiled peanuts and all that. We are all of that. But then there's also this very strange kind of sometimes coexistence. There's all these cultures, and it's a big melting pot in the South. You hear the term melting pot, you oftentimes think New York, Chicago, LA, and those are all very true. But the South is the melting pot that I think most represents the reality of American history. And it's oftentimes a very ugly reality, but I think that there's something about that is very rich and very lush, and it oftentimes unexplored in books and television. So I think the South is the true version of America. Is that maybe a scary statement to say to people? But I think there's a lot to that. Like there's something about the South that defines America's past, present, and future all at once, and I find that very fascinating.
Be interesting to ask that question again in 5 years with all this pandemic mobility.
Yes. The pandemic is definitely going to be a watershed moment for a lot of things, so we'll see.
And then Valentina, that works with me at Kleba, as booksellers, who are the folks you imagine wanting it in their hands the most? So,
Yeah, I think the first audience for it will be people interested in the Black experience, people interested in the news reports of police violence and protests, and trying to make sense of it all. So I think people who want to make sense of the last 2 years in particular, because a lot of the writing was done a lot of the final writing, I'll say that, was done during last year's quarantine, when you had the Black Lives Matter movement doing things, and you had a certain person in office as president, and all kind of weird things going on. That period in particular, I think, was one of the most confusing periods of time, when I think as a country, as globally as well, but particularly as a country, like things were happening so fast on such a large scale that we were all trying to figure out, like, where did this start? How do we get here? What's going on? There was just such a swirling mass of things. So for me, people that are still seeing the news and are still just kind of going, like, what's going on? Like, how do I make sense of this? I think that's the crowd for them. This is the book for that crowd. And then also people that are interested in minority stories, people that are interested in a lot of the social commentary on what America is and how America got to be the way it is.
It'll be interesting. I work part-time at Underground Books in Sacramento, and it is Black owned and Black focused. So it's going to be, for me as a bookseller, it's going to be very exciting to put your book in the hands of people who don't normally read fiction, because I think it can convert them.
Yeah, I hope so. Like, it's funny because most of my reading is actually nonfiction. I would say the majority of things I read are actually nonfiction. And as much as the book is having fun and poking fun at things and just kind of being absurd at times and being very heavy and deeply personal at times, there's also a lot of commentary on American history. There's a lot of nonfiction components, even beyond my story, but there's American nonfiction that gets discussed in the novel. Um, I joke people about like the fact that like there's a scene in the book that involves Nick Cage. Nick Cage just has a very high discussion on American history and a very insightful one, because I imagine that's what Nick Cage would do if I ever met him. And so, so yeah, I think it's a book that will surprise people, and that was part of my goal for it. Like I wanted it to be a book that brought you in thinking one thing, and then very quickly started to turn that expectation around, and still kept you hooked in. So that was the fun for it.
And I'm going to say hooked in even after you finished it.
Good to hear. That's very good to hear.
Next question is, what are you reading now?
Yes, right now I am reading a graphic novel actually, called Monsters by an artist named Barry Windsor Smith. If you don't know who that is, like, please be a fan of his. Like, so as a lot of people know, like I grew up reading a lot of comic books. This is before the Marvel MCU took off, like 80s and 90s comics. That was my genre, and I think I just read all the time. There's an artist named Barry Windsor Smith who wrote like the definitive Wolverine story. Like I was a big Wolverine fan, and he wrote this amazing graphic novel called Weapon X that is just still the staggering monument of comic book storytelling, in my opinion. And so I followed his art. He's very reclusive. He doesn't do a lot of work. He doesn't write a lot of stories. And his graphic novel Monsters, which follows kind of a returning soldier from a certain war and trying to reacclimate to life with all this kind of horrible disfigurement. It's a very heavy story, and it is very beautifully written and beautifully drawn. But he said it took him something like 20 some years to finish it. He'd been working on it off and on for like 20 years. And so it's kind of his magnum opus. So I'm buried in that right now and absolutely loving it.
That sounds incredible. I didn't know we had comic books in common, so we could totally geek out here, because I was an 90s comic book person too. I had the whole like John Byrne run of the X-Men.
Oh yes, yeah, that was great. Those great times. Yeah, because I got into it in the late 80s or early 90s when I was like 14 or 15. I don't want to start geeking out because there's going to be some really obscure story arcs, so I'm not going to do that. But yes, big comic book fan.
And then, how long did it take you to write this book?
So, like I said, the idea for it came almost 10 years ago now. I'll say that, but it didn't really start to manifest itself as it is now until about maybe 4 years ago. So I'll say the actual legwork of making what came through the publishing art right now is about 4 years of work. Because the book started, it stopped, it mutated, it changed. I worked on other projects, came back to it, and it just kind of kept growing. And then the last 2 years were just full active, like nose to the grindstone to see what this thing can become. And yeah, so I'll say about 4 years total, but it kind of, the idea began a while back before that.
And then let's do a final question. Are you going to be touring in person? Are you thinking about that? Are you?
Honestly, yes. It's funny. Like the irony is, when I was on tour for the returns, like my agent and I, like we had this, basically at the end of that tour, my publisher and agent were like, we can't see him on tour again. He hates book tour. Book tours are terrible for him. Like, cause there's a part on the book tour where like I literally passed out from exhaustion. Like I've got a lot of book tour stories. And so for almost a decade now, my agent has been like, hey, we got to go easy on Jason. Don't sit him on book tours. He hates book tours. He don't like having to wear suits. Like, just be nice to him. And now after a year and a half in quarantine, I'm like, please, I want to meet people. Get me out of the house. So yeah, now I'm eager to do some book touring events. I think in the fall so the book launch, I think summer is shaping up to be mostly virtual, but I do believe starting around the fall that there are some events I'm actually booked to actually travel to. So I'm looking for more of those. So that'd be great.
And you have a link to that on your website.
Yes, I will have a link to that now. If it's not up yet, it will be up soon. I've got to make sure the website's been updated, but yes.
Anything else you want to say to these beautiful people that have spent some time with us today?
No, I am really glad that everyone came out. I'm glad to be here. Like Booksellers, yeah, they're the unsung heroes. I've always said that. I tell this story a lot of times, like not booksellers, but like librarians in particular. But like, I grew up at this small town where like the local library was a train car that they converted, and that was the kids section. And I have all these really golden memories of like going and sitting in this like converted train car section and reading there. And that's where my reading kind of started. And then when I got older and was like started buying books, it was the independent booksellers who did a great job of like recommending the right book for me, the same way the librarians had before. That's why I'm very excited to kind of be here and talk to this crowd. So thank you all for what you do. You are grossly underappreciated.
Hell of a book. This hell of a book. Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks. Good night, guys.
Thanks, Jason. This is awesome.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.